The Missing Key. From Rose Cottage, a Miss Marple mystery. Chapter 1. The Locked Door. The morning mist had not yet lifted from the hedgerows of St. Mary Mead, when Agnes Whitfield found herself standing on her own doorstep, quite unable to get into her own house. It was a small indignity, the sort of thing that happens to elderly widows more often than anyone likes to admit, and Agnes, who was 73, sharp of mind if slow of foot, and prouder than she ought to have been, stood there for a full 5 minutes, jiggling the brass handle of Rose Cottage's front door before she allowed herself to feel the first flutter of unease. The key was not in her handbag, nor was it, upon later and more thorough searching, in the pocket of her cardigan, the drawer of her hall table, or the little chipped saucer by the coat hooks, where she had kept it for 11 years without incident. "I know I hung it there last night," she said to no one in particular, for there was no one else in the lane save Mrs. Hartnell's tabby cat, sunning itself with monumental indifference on the garden wall. It was young Constable Palk who eventually let her in, using the spare key kept, by long village custom, under the third flower pot from the left, a hiding place so widely known in St. Mary Mead that it could scarcely be called a secret at all. He looked over the premises with the brisk, faintly bored efficiency of a man who did not expect to find anything, and found nothing, and said as much. "Likely you put it down somewhere in the garden, Mrs. Whitfield, and a bird's carried it off, or it's under a leaf. These things happen. My own mother once lost her spectacles in the flower bin for a fortnight." He smiled the smile of a young man humouring his elders, patted the doorframe as though it were a horse that had behaved itself, and went on his way to more pressing matters, of which St. Mary Mead in June generally had few. Agnes thanked him, of course, in the manner one thanks a kind young man who has been of practical use, and watched him cycle off down the lane, with his trouser clips flashing in the pale sun, and told herself firmly that there was nothing whatever to be troubled about. St. Mary Mead was not, after all, a place where things of consequence happened. It was a place of flower shows and choir practice, of the vicar's mild sermons and Mrs. Hartnell's rather less mild opinions, of gardens tended with more devotion than most people gave their own children, and Agnes had lived within its comfortable boundaries for 30 years without once feeling the need to lock a door with any real conviction. It might have ended there, a lost key, a mild embarrassment, a story to tell over sherry, except that Agnes Whitfield was not, whatever Constable Palk believed, a woman prone to misplacing things, and within a week the small wrongnesses in Rose Cottage had begun to accumulate like leaves in a gutter. The first was trivial, a china shepherdess on the mantelpiece, which had faced the window for as long as Agnes could remember, now faced the room. She told herself she must have dusted it round without noticing. The second was less trivial, a bundle of letters from her late husband, tied with faded ribbon and kept in the bottom drawer of her writing desk, was found not quite as she had left it, the ribbon looped the wrong way, as anyone will tell you who has ever tied and retied a bow without quite matching the original knot. The third was the smell. It came to her one evening as she sat by the fire with her knitting, a ghost of a smell that did not belong in her sitting room at all. Rich, dark, faintly sweet, the unmistakable scent of pipe tobacco. Agnes had not permitted smoking in Rose Cottage since her husband's death 6 years before. She sat quite still, needles paused in her lap, and felt for the first time not merely puzzled but afraid. It was her niece, down from London for the weekend and finding her aunt unusually subdued over the teacups, who suggested, rather as an afterthought, the way one suggests calling a plumber, "Why don't you mention it to Miss Marple? She does have a knack for these things, you know. Mrs. Bantry swears by her." Agnes, who had lived in St. Mary Mead for 30 years, and had certainly heard the stories, half admiring, half indulgent, as the village told them, about the elderly spinster at the end of the lane who had solved this mystery and untangled that one, thought it a rather foolish notion. Miss Marple was, after all, Simply an old lady who grew excellent roses and had strong opinions about the choir. What could she know of locked doors and vanishing keys? And yet, 2 days later, finding the shepherdess turned to face the window once more, though she was quite certain, this time, that she had not touched it. Agnes Whitfield put on her good coat, took up her umbrella against a sky that threatened rain, and walked the 1/4 mile to Miss Marple's cottage. She found the lady of the house in her garden, secateurs in hand, regarding a rose bush with the particular intensity of a woman conducting a war. "Mrs. Whitfield," said Miss Marple, straightening with the faint creak of joints long acquainted with gardening, "how very nice. You'll take a cup of tea, I hope? You look," she added, with the mild, unhurried observation that so many people mistook for simple nosiness, "as though something has troubled you rather badly." It was, Agnes would reflect afterward, the first time in the whole unsettling business that anyone had actually looked at her properly, instead of simply listening and then explaining the matter away. Over tea in the small chintz-curtained sitting room, with its clutter of photographs and its 2 ancient armchairs angled toward the fire, Agnes told her story from the beginning: the missing key, the constable's kind dismissal, the shepherdess, the ribbon, and last of all, her voice dropping, as though the very words embarrassed her, the smell of tobacco in a house where no one smoked. Miss Marple listened without interruption, her knitting needles clicking softly, her pale blue eyes fixed somewhere beyond the teapot, in the way that those who knew her recognized as deep and careful attention rather than absence of mind. "How very interesting," she said at last, setting down her cup with the particular gentleness she reserved for things she considered important. "You know, Mrs. Whitfield, it puts me forcibly in mind of something that happened in this village some years ago, concerning a tin of biscuits and a most respectable churchwarden. But that is neither here nor there just at the moment. Tell me, my dear, who, besides yourself, has ever had occasion to hold a key to Rose Cottage?" Agnes considered. "Why, no one, that I know of. Unless you count my husband, and he's been gone 6 years. "Ah," said Miss Marple, and something in the small, quiet syllable made Agnes feel, for the first time since the mist-shrouded morning on her doorstep, that she was no longer entirely alone with the problem. "Then I think, Mrs. Whitfield, we had better begin by considering exactly who might have wanted one." Chapter 2. Whispers in the Village. News in St. Mary Mead travelled with a speed that would have shamed the telegraph, and by the following afternoon it was generally understood, in the baker's, the post office, and over 3 separate garden fences, that something odd was going on at Rose Cottage. The versions varied pleasantly in their embellishment. Mrs. Hartnell, who prided herself on knowing everything a full day before anyone else, had it that poor Agnes Whitfield had seen a ghost. The younger Mrs. Baker, newly arrived and still finding her feet in the intricate social geography of the village, had heard only that there had been a burglary, and said so, rather too loudly, in the queue at the greengrocer's. Miss Hartnell's sister, not to be confused with Mrs. Hartnell, though the village never quite managed to keep the two apart, insisted it was nothing more than an old woman's nerves, and said it in a tone that suggested she rather hoped it wasn't. Miss Marple, for her part, said very little to anyone, which was, as those who knew her well could have testified, invariably the surest sign that she was thinking a very great deal. She began, as she so often did, with what appeared to be idle conversation. A visit to the vicarage, ostensibly to discuss the flowers for Sunday service, yielded from the vicar's wife, a kindly, scattered woman named Griselda, the useful information that Agnes Whitfield's late husband, Edward, had been something of a difficult man in his final years, prone to disputes with his own family over money, and that there had been some unpleasantness, my dear, about an inheritance, though I never did get the whole of it. You know how these things get about only in pieces. A call at the greengrocer's, where Miss Marple purchased rather more runner beans than she strictly required, produced the observation, delivered by the greengrocer himself, a Mr. Tompkins with a genuine fondness for gossip disguised as commerce, that a stranger had been seen twice that week, walking the lane past Rose Cottage of an evening. A gentleman, not from these parts, smoking a pipe, if you take my meaning, Miss Marple, and lingering rather longer than a man out for his health generally does. This last detail Miss Marple received with the particular stillness of a woman filing something away with great care. It was Constable Palk, encountered rather by design than by accident near the War Memorial, who provided the least useful and most revealing testimony of all. "Between you and me, Miss Marple," he said, with the confiding air of a young man who considered himself broadly sensible and the village's elderly ladies to be, on the whole, given to fancy, "I don't think there's anything in it. Mrs. Whitfield's a dear old soul, but she is getting on, and old people do lose things and imagine things. No disrespect meant. I looked over that cottage myself. Nothing broken, nothing forced. If someone's been in and out of Rose Cottage, they've done it without so much as scratching the paint on a window latch. And I ask you, how likely is that?" "How likely indeed," said Miss Marple, with a mildness that Constable Palk, not for the first time, and not for the last, entirely failed to recognize as anything other than agreement. "Of course," he went on, warming rather to his own theory, "old ladies do get fanciful, living alone as they do. My aunt in Much Benham was convinced for a whole summer that someone was stealing her milk bottles, and it turned out to be nothing more than the milkman changing his round without telling her. People imagine a great deal when they've too much time and too little company to fill it with." "They do indeed imagine a great deal," Miss Marple agreed, "though I have generally found, Constable, that it is quite as dangerous to assume every fear is imaginary as it is to assume every fear is justified. The trick, I think, lies in examining each one on its own particular merits, rather than deciding the matter in advance, according to how old or how alone the person happens to be who is doing the fearing." Constable Palk, who had not expected to be quite so gently corrected, coloured slightly and said that he supposed there was something in that, and touched his helmet, and went on his way rather more thoughtfully than he had intended. She thought about it a good deal on her walk home, turning the constable's own logic over in her mind, like a stone she suspected of hiding something beneath it. No broken window, no forced door, and yet a woman who did not imagine things, imagining things 3 times over, in 3 different and specific ways. It was not the great, dramatic clues that interested Miss Marple, not at least at first. It was the small, human inconsistencies. A shepherdess turned the wrong way was nothing at all, unless one considered that whoever had touched it must have moved it to look out of the window themselves, and then failed, in replacing it, to notice which way it had originally faced, which suggested someone unfamiliar with the room, and yet familiar enough with the house, to know precisely where a spare key might be found, since no window or door showed any sign of forcing. That, Miss Marple thought, walking briskly past the church with her market basket over one arm, was the whole crux of the matter. Someone had a key, not the lost key, for that, she rather suspected, had simply been lost, an ordinary misfortune upon which a more calculated scheme had since been built, but another key, an old key perhaps, from a time when more than one person had held one, which returned her, inevitably, to Agnes Whitfield's husband, 6 years dead, and to whatever unpleasantness had once passed between him and his family over an inheritance that Griselda, the vicar's wife, could not quite remember the whole of. Some things, Miss Marple reflected, took a very long time to finish happening. Chapter 3. Tea and Observations. Miss Marple returned to Rose Cottage 2 days later, ostensibly to bring Agnes Whitfield a jar of her own gooseberry preserve, and in reality to look, with the unhurried thoroughness of a woman who had spent a lifetime being underestimated, at everything the cottage had to tell her. She began with the shepherdess. "May I?" she asked, and without waiting for more than Agnes's puzzled nod, lifted the little china figure from the mantelpiece and turned it over in her hands. It was unremarkable, a common enough ornament, the sort sold at any number of shops, save for a fine crack along the base, old and long mended, and a small chip at the shepherdess's crook that had clearly been there for years. "You've had this a long while, I think," said Miss Marple. "It was a wedding present," said Agnes, "from Edward's mother, 40 years ago, if it's a day, and it has always faced the window. Always. I like to see her catching the morning light." Miss Marple set the shepherdess down again, carefully, facing the window as it had always faced, and said nothing more about it, though Agnes had the distinct impression that something of importance had just occurred, somewhere behind those pale, unhurried eyes. Next came the letters. Agnes fetched the bundle from the writing desk, and Miss Marple examined the ribbon with the same close attention she had given the shepherdess, though she touched nothing. "You tied this yourself originally?" "Years ago. I always tie a simple bow. My mother taught me the way of it. Left over right, then a loop. And this," Miss Marple indicated the ribbon as it now lay, "is tied right over left." Agnes looked and went rather pale. "I hadn't noticed. How very odd." "Not odd at all, Mrs. Whitfield, if one considers that whoever retied it was not thinking of bows in the least, but only of appearing to have left the letters undisturbed. And most people, when hurrying to disguise a thing, get the small details wrong precisely because they are hurrying." Miss Marple smiled, the small, satisfied smile of a woman who had confirmed a suspicion rather than discovered a surprise. "It tells us two things, my dear. First, that your visitor can read, since it was the letters themselves, not merely the drawer, that interested them. And second, that they were careful enough to want the disturbance hidden, which suggests someone who did not wish to be thought a common thief, but something rather more particular." "But why?" Agnes asked, still turning the ribbon over in her mind. "Would anyone go to such trouble over a bundle of old love letters? There's nothing in them but Edward's rather clumsy poetry and a great many complaints about the weather in Brighton, where we spent our honeymoon. I could recite you whole paragraphs, if it would help, though I doubt they'd tell you anything a burglar would find worth the risk of climbing in at a window." "That, I think, is precisely the point, Mrs. Whitfield," said Miss Marple. "Our visitor was not interested in the letters themselves at all, I fancy, but was making quite certain, methodically and rather thoroughly, that nothing of importance had been left folded inside them, tucked between the pages, so to speak, the way one sometimes slips a pressed flower or an old photograph into a book one intends to keep. It suggests to me a search conducted with real patience, room by room and drawer by drawer, by someone who did not know precisely where the thing they wanted might be hidden, only that it existed, and that Rose Cottage was very probably where it lay." Agnes set down her teacup with a small, unsteady clatter. "You make it sound as though they were looking for something, not merely intruding." "I rather think they were," said Miss Marple. "The question, Mrs. Whitfield, is what? May I ask, did your husband correspond with anyone in particular in his last years? Business matters, family matters, anything at all that might have seemed, to him, worth keeping close." Agnes was quiet for a long moment, twisting her wedding ring, a habit Miss Marple noted with interest, as people so often revealed more in such small unconscious gestures than in whole paragraphs of deliberate speech. "There was his brother," Agnes said finally. "Cecil. They quarrelled dreadfully the year before Edward died, over their mother's estate, though I never understood the whole of it. Edward wouldn't discuss it with me. He only said, once, that he'd settled it properly, and put it somewhere Cecil would never think to look." Miss Marple's needles, which had been clicking steadily throughout the conversation, went suddenly still. "Did he indeed?" she said softly. "Now that, Mrs. Whitfield, is very interesting indeed." Chapter 4. The Neighbour's Alibi. It was while walking home from Rose Cottage, turning the matter of Cecil Whitfield over in her mind, that Miss Marple encountered Mr. Gerald Pembroke at his garden gate, and found herself, not for the first time in a long career of such encounters, engaged in what appeared to be the merest pleasantry, and was, in fact, nothing of the kind. Mr. Pembroke had come to St. Mary Mead some 18 months before, taking the pleasant little house adjoining Rose Cottage's garden, and had made himself, in the manner of newcomers who wish to be liked, rather more agreeable than the village generally required. He kept excellent hours, contributed generously to the church roof fund, and had a pleasant habit of complimenting the older ladies of the parish on their gardens, which had won him a good deal of easy popularity. "Miss Marple," he said now, with every appearance of delight. "How fortunate! I understand poor Mrs. Whitfield has been having a rather worrying time of it. I do hope nothing serious." "One never quite knows, does one?" said Miss Marple pleasantly, "what is serious and what is not, until a good deal later than one would like. Tell me, Mr. Pembroke, did you happen to notice anything unusual next door? You're so close. After all, one would think you'd be the first to see anything out of the ordinary." "Not a thing, I'm afraid, though I've hardly been at home to notice. I was up in London a good part of last week. Business, you know, and only back Tuesday evening. My sister will vouch for it. I stayed with her the whole while, in Kensington." He said this smoothly, with the easy fluency of a man reciting something he had said before, and Miss Marple, who had spent 70 years listening to the particular music of the truth and the subtly different music of a story well rehearsed, noted the smoothness with polite and apparently idle interest. "How very sensible, to have someone to vouch for one," she said. "One does like to have one's movements accounted for. I'm sure I couldn't tell you, myself, precisely where I was of an evening a week past. One's days blur so, at my age." "Oh, I shouldn't think you forget much, Miss Marple," said Mr. Pembroke, with a laugh that held perhaps a fraction more caution than the joke required. "The village does rather talk about your memory." "The village talks about a great many things," said Miss Marple, smiling. "Most of them only half true. Good afternoon, Mr. Pembroke. Do give my regards to your sister, should you write to her." She lingered a moment longer at the gate, admiring with entirely genuine appreciation a bed of delphiniums that Mr. Pembroke had clearly tended with some care. "You've a good hand with a garden, Mr. Pembroke. One wouldn't think it, from a bachelor gentleman up from town. Most young men of business haven't the patience for it. My mother kept a fine garden when I was a boy," he said, and there was something in the way he said it, a small catch, quickly smoothed over, that Miss Marple noted with as much interest as she had noted the smoothness of his alibi. "One picks up more than one realizes, watching even without meaning to." "One does indeed," said Miss Marple. "I find it is very often the things we absorb without meaning to that tell us the most about ourselves, Mr. Pembroke, rather more sometimes than the things we take a great deal of trouble to learn on purpose." She continued on her way, and if Mr. Pembroke found anything troubling in that last small remark, the faint, courteous suggestion that his alibi might yet be tested by the very simplest of means, a letter, a postmark, a sister's honest recollection, he did not show it. But Miss Marple, glancing back once at his garden gate, thought she saw him stand a moment longer than was natural before turning back to his roses, and she filed that observation away with all the others, the shepherdess, the ribbon, the tobacco, and now a smooth, well-rehearsed alibi from a pleasant neighbour who had arrived in St. Mary Mead only 18 months before, at almost exactly the time, she now recalled, that old Mrs. Whitfield's husband had first begun quarrelling so bitterly with his brother. It was, Miss Marple reflected, walking home in the gathering dusk with her empty preserve jar under her arm, precisely the sort of coincidence that so rarely turned out, upon close examination, to be a coincidence at all. Chapter 5. The Trellis Clue. The garden of Rose Cottage ran alongside Mr. Pembroke's own, separated by nothing more formidable than a low stone wall and a wooden trellis thick with the climbing roses for which Agnes Whitfield's late husband had once been mildly famous at the village flower show. Miss Marple, who understood gardens the way other people understood accounts or Latin grammar, returned to Rose Cottage the following morning with the stated intention of admiring the roses and the unstated intention of examining the trellis, which she had noted, on her very first visit, to be disturbed in a manner that no rose, however vigorous, could account for. "You've had trouble with the trellis, I think," she said to Agnes, running one gloved finger along a section where the old wood had splintered and two of the crosspieces hung loose from their nails. "The wind, I always supposed," said Agnes. "We do get it something fierce off the fields in spring." "The wind," said Miss Marple thoughtfully, "generally pushes a trellis outward, from the garden it belongs to, since that is the direction from which it blows against a fence built to face the weather. This one has been pushed inward, toward your garden, Mrs. Whitfield, not away from it. And here, if you look closely, the wood has been scuffed along the top rail in a way that suggests someone climbing over, rather than simply leaning against it." Agnes bent, with some difficulty, to look, and saw what Miss Marple meant: a pale scar in the old grey wood, exactly where a boot might rest in the act of swinging a leg over. "But that would mean—" Agnes stopped, her hand going to her throat. "That would mean," said Miss Marple gently, "that whoever has been coming and going from Rose Cottage has been doing so from the direction of Mr. Pembroke's garden, and not from the lane at all, which is why no one walking past on the road has ever seen anything amiss." She straightened, brushing a fleck of lichen from her glove, and looked thoughtfully toward the low stone wall and the pleasant house beyond it, its windows catching the morning sun with an innocence Miss Marple had learned, over many years, to regard with the greatest possible suspicion. "There is one thing further I should like to look at, if you don't mind, Mrs. Whitfield. The ground beneath the trellis, just there, where the earth is soft." They found the footprints together, faint, half filled in by a week of intermittent rain, but distinct enough to the patient eye. A man's boot, of moderate size, the sole worn slightly more on the outer edge, as though its owner favored one leg over the other in walking, a detail Miss Marple noted with the quiet satisfaction of a woman adding a very useful brick to a wall she was constructing with great care. "Mr. Pembroke," she said conversationally, straightening once more and pressing a hand briefly to the small of her back, "walks with the very slightest unevenness. Have you noticed? Nothing one would remark upon, ordinarily. A young man's old football injury, he told me once, quite cheerfully, when I asked after it." Agnes stared at her. "You cannot mean to suggest that Mr. Pembroke, such a pleasant, respectable man—" "I mean to suggest nothing at all as yet," said Miss Marple, with the particular firmness she reserved for moments when an accusation, however tempting, would have been premature. "I have learned, Mrs. Whitfield, over a good many years and a good many puzzles, that the pleasantest people are very often the ones who have taken the most particular care to seem so, and that a genuinely innocent man rarely troubles to have his sister ready with an alibi before anyone has thought to ask for one. But suspicion is not proof, and I should be very sorry indeed to see an innocent man's reputation damaged on the strength of a worn boot heel and a badly retied ribbon." She paused at the garden gate, looking back at the splintered trellis with an expression Agnes could not quite read, something between satisfaction and a deeper, more troubled thoughtfulness. "What I should like to know," Miss Marple went on, half to herself, "is not merely who has been climbing your trellis, Mrs. Whitfield, but why now, after 6 years of your husband's death, when whatever he hid, if hidden it truly was, might have been searched for at any time in all those years, and was not. Something has changed very recently to make this search urgent, and that, I think, is the true key to the whole affair." Rather more so than the poor brass one you lost from the saucer by your coat hooks, which I am now very nearly certain had nothing to do with the matter at all, beyond providing our intruder with a convenient excuse to establish, in the village's mind, that Rose Cottage's security could not be relied upon. Agnes looked at the trellis a long moment, and then at her own garden beyond it, the roses her husband had once tended so proudly, and seemed to see the whole familiar view suddenly through quite different eyes. "I have sat in this garden every fine evening for 6 years," she said slowly, "and never once thought to look at my own trellis as though it were evidence of anything. It is a very strange feeling, Miss Marple, to have one's own home turned, quite suddenly, into a puzzle to be solved." "It is one of the stranger feelings life offers us," Miss Marple agreed. "And I am sorry you should have to feel it, Mrs. Whitfield, in a place that ought to hold nothing but comfort for you. But I find, on the whole, that the discomfort of looking closely at one's own surroundings is very much preferable to the much greater discomfort of continuing to live, unknowingly, beside a danger one has simply declined to examine." "You think it was planned? The key going missing, I mean?" "I think," said Miss Marple carefully, "that a lost key makes a marvellous smokescreen for a spare one, quietly obtained long before, from a time when more than one person might reasonably have held it. But I should not like to say more until I have spoken with a few more people, and looked, if I can manage it, at your husband's old business papers, assuming, Mrs. Whitfield, that you have kept any." Agnes had, as it happened, kept a great many, stored, with the particular carelessness of grief, in a tin trunk in the box-room upstairs, untouched, she confessed, since the week after Edward's funeral, when the task of sorting through them had proved more than she could bear. "Then I think," said Miss Marple, with the brisk, gentle decisiveness that had settled more village mysteries than the whole of the St. Mary Mead constabulary put together, "that we had better go up and look at them together, my dear, before anyone else has the chance to." Chapter 6. Village Gossip. The tin trunk, when they hauled it into the light of the box-room's single dusty window, proved to contain a life reduced to paper. Old receipts, a faded photograph of Edward Whitfield as a young man in cricket whites, correspondence from a firm of solicitors in the county town, and, near the bottom, a slim bundle of letters tied, Miss Marple noted with quiet interest, in the same simple bow that Agnes herself favoured, undisturbed by any careless hand, since no intruder had yet found their way to the box-room. "These are from Cecil," said Agnes, turning the bundle over. "Edward's brother. I never read them. It felt like prying, even after he'd gone." Miss Marple, with Agnes's permission clearly granted, read them now, quickly and carefully, her lips moving very slightly as she did so. A habit, Agnes reflected, that made the old lady look rather more like a schoolgirl at her lessons than the formidable amateur detective the village whispered about. The letters told, in the clipped, resentful language of brothers who had once been close and were no longer, a story some 30 years in the making. Their mother, Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, had died shortly after the war, leaving an estate that should, by any reasonable accounting, have been divided evenly between her 2 sons. It had not been a codicil to her will, added, Cecil's letters implied with increasing bitterness across several years of correspondence, under circumstances he considered highly irregular, had left the larger portion, including a small but valuable piece of land on the edge of the village, to Edward alone. Cecil had contested it, had lost, had written, in his final and angriest letter, dated a bare 18 months before Edward's death, "You have taken what was never rightfully only yours, and you know it, Edward. Whatever paper says otherwise, I shall not let the matter rest merely because a solicitor's clerk once made an error in my favour that you were quick enough to have corrected." "An error in his favour," Miss Marple repeated softly, setting the letter down. "Now that is a very particular choice of words, Mrs. Whitfield, and I think it tells us a very great deal. Do you know, did your husband ever mention a Mr. Renfrew?" A solicitor's clerk, perhaps, who might have handled his mother's will. Agnes frowned, searching her memory. There was a Mr. Renfrew, yes, retired now, I believe, but he used to do work for half the families in the district. Edward saw him privately, once or twice, in his last year. I never asked what about. One didn't, with Edward, when he had that particular look about him. It was this thread, slender, but unmistakably real, that Miss Marple pulled at over the following 2 days, moving through St. Mary Mead's web of shops, church committees and garden fences, with the patient, unhurried thoroughness that had, over so many years, made her rather more effective than the entire county police force combined, though she would have been the first to deny any such comparison, out of what her friends recognized as entirely genuine modesty. From the vicar's wife over sherry and a discussion of the flower rota that Miss Marple steered, with practiced skill, toward more useful matters, she learned that Mr. Renfrew now lived in a cottage on the London road, a widower himself, and rarely came into the village save for church on the great festivals. From Mr. Tompkins the greengrocer she learned, delivered between the weighing of potatoes and the wrapping of a cabbage, that the stranger seen smoking his pipe near Rose Cottage had been noticed again, this time in conversation, briefly and rather furtively, with Mr. Pembroke himself, outside the Blue Boar public house, though neither man had seemed to wish to be seen together, and had parted. Mr. Tompkins understood from his nephew, who tended bar there, sharp enough, like men who'd quarrelled, or nearly, and from Mrs. Hartnell, who required no coaxing whatsoever, being constitutionally unable to withhold information from anyone who appeared willing to listen. Miss Marple learned that Mr. Pembroke had, in fact, been seen at the county town's records office some 3 weeks before, on what business Mrs. Hartnell could not say, though she had it on good authority from her cousin who worked there, that he had asked to see certain very old land registrations. There was, too, a small conversation with Mrs. Bantry, Miss Marple's oldest friend in the village, who listened to the whole account over a rather generous glass of sherry, with the particular relish of a woman who had, by her own frequent admission, married a colonel largely for the excellent quality of village gossip that came with the position. "You always did have a nose for this sort of thing, Jane," said Mrs. Bantry, refilling both glasses without being asked. "Do you remember the business with the vicar's stolen collection plate? I told everyone it was the choir master, and you told me, very gently, that I was quite wrong, and of course, you were right, as you generally are, and it turned out to be that dreadful little man who did the flowers." "I remember it made a great many people very uncomfortable for a week or two," said Miss Marple, "which is generally the price one pays for the truth in a village this size, Dolly. People would so much rather believe in an outsider's wickedness than a neighbour's. It is more comfortable, but I am afraid it is very rarely more accurate. And is it an outsider this time, or a neighbour?" Miss Marple considered the question with the particular care she gave to questions she was not yet prepared to answer, even to her closest friend. "I rather think, Dolly, that it may turn out to be both at once, which is generally the most uncomfortable sort of answer a village can be given, and very often the truest." "Land registrations," Miss Marple murmured to herself that evening, sitting by her own fire, with her knitting entirely forgotten in her lap. "Now that, I think, brings us very much closer to the heart of the matter." For if Cecil Whitfield's disputed inheritance had truly hinged upon a small parcel of land at the edge of the village, and if that land had, in the 60 years since, quietly increased a great deal in value, as land near a growing village so often does, then a stranger's urgent interest in old registrations, and a pleasant neighbour's sudden and convenient arrival next door to Rose Cottage, began to look a very great deal less like coincidence, and a very great deal more like the opening moves of a long and patient game. Chapter 7. The Wartime Letter. It was Agnes Whitfield herself, 3 days later, who found the letter that changed the shape of everything Miss Marple had so far pieced together. found it not through any great cleverness, but through the ordinary, exhausting business of continuing to sort through her husband's tin trunk, a task she had begun, at Miss Marple's gentle urging, to find rather less painful than she had feared. And even, in a modest way, "Miss Marple," she said, arriving breathless at the cottage door with an envelope clutched in one hand, "you must come and see this at once." The letter was dated some 4 years before Edward Whitfield's death, and was addressed to him in a hand Agnes did not recognize, a Mr. J. Renfrew, of the solicitor's clerk's own address on the London road, writing in a manner that was, even to Miss Marple's experienced eye, remarkably indiscreet for a man in his profession. "Dear Whitfield," it began, without ceremony, "I have thought a great deal on our conversation, and I confess, it sits uneasily with me still. What was done in your mother's estate was done at your father's particular and repeated instruction, delivered to me privately in the last months of his own life, and I have never doubted that it reflected his true wish, whatever your brother may say, or believe, or choose to tell himself in his bitterness. But I did make an error, Whitfield, in the drafting of the codicil, an error of description regarding the boundary of the land in question, which I corrected, perhaps I should say, which I quietly altered, at your request, rather than your father's, some months after your father had died, and could no longer be consulted on the matter. I have carried that particular weight a long while, and though I do not repent of my loyalty to an old client and an old friendship, I think it only right to tell you plainly, should the true boundary ever come to be properly surveyed, or should the original instruction your father gave me ever come to light in his own hand, I do not know that your position would survive it. I trust you will forgive an old man's late attack of conscience." Miss Marple read this twice through, very slowly, and then set it down upon the tea-table with the particular care she gave to things of real importance. "Well, Mrs. Whitfield," she said at last, "I think we have found, if not quite the whole truth, then very nearly its skeleton. Your husband's brother did not lose his inheritance through any fair or honest process. He lost it through an alteration made after your father-in-law's death by a solicitor's clerk, acting, one must suppose, out of loyalty to Edward rather than strict duty to the law, an alteration that Mr. Renfrew himself has here confessed, in his own hand, could not withstand a proper survey, or the discovery of your father-in-law's original written instructions." "Then Cecil was right all along," Agnes whispered. "Edward cheated him." "I think it exceedingly likely," said Miss Marple, not unkindly. "Which raises, of course, a very pressing question. Where are those original instructions now? The ones your father-in-law gave, before Mr. Renfrew's alteration? For if they still exist, in your father-in-law's own hand, they would overturn 60 years of settled inheritance, and restore to Cecil Whitfield's heirs a piece of land that has, I understand, become considerably more valuable since the war. And I think, Mrs. Whitfield, we both know already what your late husband told you he had done with anything he wished kept safely out of anyone's reach." Agnes's hand went, unconsciously, to the floor beneath her feet. "He put it somewhere Cecil would never think to look," she said slowly, remembering, "under the floorboards. Oh, Miss Marple, I've walked over whatever it is every day for 6 years, and never once thought to wonder." She sat quite still for a moment, the letter trembling slightly in her hand, and Miss Marple, watching her with the particular gentleness she reserved for those moments when an old grief and a new discovery arrived together, poured her a second cup of tea without being asked. "It is a hard thing," Miss Marple said, "to learn that someone we loved was not entirely the man we believed him to be. I have seen it happen a good many times in a good many houses, Mrs. Whitfield, and I will tell you what I have always found truest in the telling of it. A person may do a wrong thing, even a very wrong thing, and still have loved you honestly and well in every other particular of his life. Your husband hid a paper. He did not, I think, hide his heart from you, and I should not let the one discovery unmake the other if I were in your position." Agnes wiped her eyes with the corner of her handkerchief and managed, at last, a small, unsteady smile. "You are very kind, Miss Marple, to say so. I only wish I knew what to do next." "For the moment," said Miss Marple briskly, setting down the teapot, "I think we had much better go and see whether Edward left anything else beneath those floorboards of his, before we decide what is to be done about any of it." Chapter 8. The Floorboard Secret. They found it, in the end, not in the sitting room, where 6 years of careless footsteps might easily have loosened a board, but in the small back study that Edward Whitfield had kept, in his lifetime, very much to himself, and which Agnes had left largely untouched since his death, as though the room itself still belonged to him. It was Miss Marple's eye, moving carefully across the old oak flooring in the fading afternoon light, that found the board, not warped by damp or age like its neighbours, but cut, quite deliberately, with a fine saw along one edge, and fitted back so cleverly that only a very close and deliberate inspection would have revealed the seam at all. "Here, I think, Mrs. Whitfield," she said, and Agnes, kneeling with some difficulty on the hard floor, worked her fingers into the narrow gap and lifted the board free. Beneath it lay a shallow cavity, lined with oilcloth against the damp, containing a single flat tin box, rather like the sort used for important documents, and inside that, wrapped once more in oilcloth, a single folded sheet of paper, brittle with age, in a hand neither of them recognized. It was dated some 3 years before Eleanor Whitfield's death, and signed, in a shaking but perfectly legible script, by her husband, Edward and Cecil's father, instructing, in plain and unambiguous terms, that the land at the village's edge should pass equally to both his sons, share and share alike, as befits two brothers who I hope will always stand together, whatever quarrels time may bring between them, for land, divided in bitterness, serves no one, and I would not have my sons made enemies over an acre of ground. Agnes read it through twice, her eyes filling with tears she made no effort to hide. "He knew," she said. "Edward knew all along what his father truly wanted, and he hid it here, in this house, rather than destroy it, as though even he could not quite bring himself to burn his own father's last wish." "People very rarely can," said Miss Marple gently, taking the fragile paper with great care and setting it upon the desk. "It is one of the small mercies of human nature, Mrs. Whitfield, that even the most determined wrongdoer very often keeps some small proof of his own wrongdoing, out of guilt or sentiment, or simply the deep human unwillingness to destroy the last words of a parent, however inconvenient those words may have become. It is why so very few crimes, in my experience, are ever quite as perfectly hidden as their authors believe." She looked at the tin box, empty now save for a scrap of oilcloth, and at the neat, deliberate cut along the floorboard's edge, and felt the last piece of the puzzle settle, with a small and satisfying click, into its proper place. "This, I think, is precisely what our intruder has been searching for these 6 weeks past, Mrs. Whitfield, though I confess I do not yet know whether they knew exactly where to look, or only that it existed somewhere within these walls. Either way, I think we must move a good deal more carefully than we have done so far. A man or woman who has waited this long and searched this patiently for something worth so very much money is unlikely to give up simply because a locked door has, for the moment, held." She glanced toward the study window, and the low stone wall beyond it, and the pleasant house next door, with its innocent, sun-catching windows, and her expression, for just a moment, lost every trace of its usual mild good humor. "I think, my dear Mrs. Whitfield," she said quietly, "that we had better take very particular care, from this evening onward, that Rose Cottage is not left empty after dark. Agnes wrapped the fragile document once more in its oilcloth, her hands not quite steady, and looked to Miss Marple as though for reassurance she was not entirely certain existed to be given. "Do you think we are in real danger, Miss Marple? I have never in my life been afraid in my own home, not even after Edward died, and I found myself alone here for the first time in 30 years. "I think," said Miss Marple, choosing her words with evident care, "that whoever has searched this house so patiently, and for so long, has a very great deal resting on what that paper says, and people with a great deal resting on a single outcome are not, in my experience, inclined to give up gracefully merely because the search has grown difficult. But I do not think, Mrs. Whitfield, that you need face it alone. I intend to see this matter through to its proper conclusion, and I do not intend to do so carelessly." Chapter 9. The Second Break-In. Miss Marple's warning proved, within 3 nights, to be rather more prescient than even she had hoped. Agnes Whitfield, at Miss Marple's suggestion, had taken to spending her evenings not alone in Rose Cottage, but at the vicarage, under the cheerful, undemanding company of Griselda, returning only after dark with the vicar himself for escort, a small precaution that Miss Marple had insisted upon with a firmness Agnes had not thought to question, though she had privately thought it all rather excessive, until the night everything changed. It was young Constable Palk, making his ordinary rounds a little after 11, who first heard the sound of breaking glass from the direction of Rose Cottage's back study, and who arrived, blowing his whistle with more enthusiasm than skill, to find the study window forced inward, and a man's dark shape disappearing over the low stone wall toward Mr. Pembroke's garden. He gave chase, creditably, if not quite successfully, for the intruder had the advantage of knowing the ground and the darkness both, and Constable Palk, encumbered by his heavy boots and a torch that chose that particular moment to fail, came to grief over a garden rake left carelessly in the grass, and went down hard, striking his head against the low wall with a force that left him, for some minutes, quite unable to rise. It was this, the sound of the constable's fall, and his subsequent cry, more startled than pained, that finally raised the alarm across the sleeping village, bringing Mr. Pembroke himself, in dressing gown and slippers, hurrying out with a lamp, full of concerned questions, and the vicar and Agnes, returning at that very moment from the vicarage, to find the young constable sitting dazed against the wall, with blood trickling from a cut above his eyebrow, and no sign whatever of the man he had been chasing. "Are you badly hurt?" Agnes cried, kneeling beside him despite her own considerable difficulty in doing so, while the vicar hurried for water, and Mr. Pembroke hovered, offering brandy from a flask he happened, rather conveniently, to have about his person. "Nothing broken, I think, ma'am, only shaken," said the constable, wincing as he touched the cut above his eye. "But he was in the study, right enough, and he'd been at the floorboards again, torn half the room up, by the look of it, before I disturbed him." Miss Marple, arriving somewhat later than the others, having been roused from her bed by the commotion, and taken rather longer than a younger woman to dress and make her way down the lane, surveyed the scene with the calm, careful attention of a woman who found violence deeply distasteful, and information, gathered even at such a moment, entirely indispensable. "You saw nothing of his face, Constable?" "Nothing at all, Miss Marple. Dark as pitch, and he moved too quick." Palk managed a rueful, pained smile. "I'll say this for him, though. He knew that garden wall better than I did, and I've patrolled this lane 4 years." It was Mr. Pembroke, hovering solicitously with his brandy flask, who provided the detail Miss Marple found most instructive of all. "I heard nothing myself until the constable's cry," he said, with every appearance of concern. "I was reading rather late. I do sleep badly, I'm afraid, and often sit up with a book until all hours. Dreadful business. One doesn't like to think of such things happening in a place like St. Mary Mead." "One doesn't indeed," said Miss Marple pleasantly, though her eyes moved, briefly and without any great show of interest, to Mr. Pembroke's slippers, Entirely dry, she noted, on a night when the grass beyond his garden gate stood heavy with dew, and a man who had truly sat reading indoors the whole evening would have had no occasion whatever to wet them. She said nothing of this observation aloud. It was, after all, precisely the sort of small, easily explained detail, a spilled glass of water perhaps, or a moment spent checking the weather from the doorstep, that a clever man might account for in a dozen perfectly innocent ways, if given the chance to think of an explanation before being asked for one. And Miss Marple had learned over a great many years that the surest way to lose a piece of evidence was to reveal too soon that one had noticed it. Instead, she turned her attention to the study itself, once the excitement had died sufficiently for her to slip inside unremarked, and found precisely what Constable Palk had described. 3 further floorboards prized up and left standing on end, the tin box's hiding place clearly discovered, but— and here Miss Marple felt the first small flicker of genuine relief in the whole troubling evening— empty, since the precious document itself now lay locked in the vicarage's own small safe, where she had persuaded Agnes to place it 2 days before, on the entirely reasonable grounds that a house already broken into once could hardly be trusted to keep it safe a second time. The vicar, returning at last from fetching water and a clean cloth for the constable's cut, found Miss Marple already deep in quiet conversation with him, and could not help remarking, as he so often did, on the curious calm that seemed to settle over her in moments when everyone else's nerves were most thoroughly shaken. "You don't seem in the least alarmed, Miss Marple," he said, not without a certain admiration. "And I confess I am, rather. To think of a man forcing his way in, not 200 yards from the vicarage, and poor Palk laid out on the grass for his trouble." "I am a good deal more alarmed than I appear, Vicar," said Miss Marple, and there was, for once, no mildness at all in her voice. "A man who breaks glass and risks a constable's injury to search for something he did not find on his first attempt is not a man conducting himself with any great caution, and a lack of caution in a determined person is, I find, very often the most dangerous thing of all. I think we must move a good deal more quickly now than I had originally intended." "He was looking for something he has still not found," Miss Marple murmured to herself, standing amid the wreckage of splintered boards in the small, disordered study. "And a man who has searched this hard, and this violently, and come away with nothing, is a man who will not simply give up and go quietly home. He will try again, and soon, and I think this time we had better be ready for him rather than merely surprised by him." Chapter 10. Piecing Together. The morning after the break-in found Miss Marple not, as the village rather expected, closeted anxiously with Agnes Whitfield, discussing the shock of it all, but walking with brisk purpose to the small cottage on the London road, where Mr. Renfrew, retired solicitor's clerk, now lived out his quiet days among his roses and his memories. He was an old man, stooped and careful in his movements, with the particular gentle melancholy of someone who has spent a long life keeping other people's secrets, and has begun, in his final years, to find the weight of them rather more than he can comfortably carry alone. "Miss Marple," he said, when she had introduced herself and stated her business with the plain directness she reserved for moments when delicacy would only waste valuable time. "I wondered if someone might come to me eventually about that old business. I have not slept easily since Edward Whitfield died, if I am honest with you. A conscience is a poor companion for an old man's last years, and mine has grown rather insistent of late." "Then perhaps," said Miss Marple gently, settling herself into the chair he offered, "you would find it something of a relief to speak of it plainly, Mr. Renfrew." "I think I already know a good part of the story. I have read your letter to Edward Whitfield, you see, and I have found the document his father truly left. What I do not yet know is who else has learned what you and Edward once arranged between you, and how recently they learned it." Mr. Renfrew was silent for a long moment, his hands, spotted with age, folding and unfolding in his lap. "His nephew," he said at last, heavily. "Cecil's son. Cecil Whitfield's boy, Andrew, though he goes by another name now, I understand, since he was raised mostly by his mother's people after Cecil's own death some years back, and never had much cause to love the Whitfield name. He came to me perhaps 2 months ago, Miss Marple, asking questions about his grandfather's will. Civil enough about it, but persistent, the way a young man is persistent when he believes an old wrong has been done to his own family, and means to see it righted. Or perhaps, Mr. Renfrew added, with evident reluctance, means to see it turned rather more to his own private advantage than his father ever intended." "And did you tell him the truth?" "I told him more than I should have," Mr. Renfrew admitted. "Enough, certainly, to send him looking for proof of it. Proof I knew Edward had never quite been able to bring himself to destroy, whatever else his sins. I did not think, Miss Marple, that it would come to breaking into an old woman's home in the dead of night. I had rather hoped, God forgive me for a foolish old man, that he might simply go to a solicitor of his own and challenge the matter properly, in the light of day." Miss Marple absorbed this with the quiet, careful satisfaction of a woman watching a picture, long assembled piece by piece, finally resolve into its complete and recognizable shape. "One more question, Mr. Renfrew, and then I shall leave you in peace. This young man, Andrew, or whatever name he now goes by, do you know if he smokes a pipe? And do you know whether he walks with any unevenness, a slight favoring of one leg perhaps from an old injury?" Mr. Renfrew looked at her with something between surprise and a dawning, weary comprehension. "Now that you mention it, Miss Marple, yes, to both. A pipe, and rather a good one, I recall thinking, for a young man who did not seem otherwise particularly well off. And yes, a limp, though slight. He mentioned once that he'd broken his leg badly as a boy, playing football, and it had never quite set right." Miss Marple rose, drawing her gloves back onto her hands with the neat, unhurried finality of a woman who has finished a piece of business entirely to her satisfaction. "Thank you, Mr. Renfrew. I think you have given me the very last piece I required. I would only say, and I hope you will not think it impertinent, from a stranger, that a man who unburdens an old guilt honestly, even very late, generally sleeps a good deal better for it than one who carries it silently to his grave. I hope you will find that to be true in your own case." Chapter 11. The Confrontation. It took Miss Marple 2 further days to arrange matters entirely to her satisfaction. Days spent in quiet conversation with the vicar, with a rather more attentive Constable Palk, and, at last, with Agnes Whitfield herself, to whom she explained, gently, but without softening any part of the truth, precisely what had been done to Cecil's inheritance, and by whom, and why a young man calling himself Gerald Pembroke had come to St. Mary Mead 18 months before, taking a pleasant house beside Rose Cottage's garden under a name that was not, Miss Marple was now quite certain, his own. "He is Andrew Whitfield," she told Agnes, "Cecil's son and your husband's own nephew, whatever name he has chosen to live under these past 18 months. I do not think he came here originally intending violence, Mrs. Whitfield. I think he came intending only to search, quietly and patiently, for the proof his father always believed existed, and to take, if he found it, rather more of your late husband's estate than the law would ever have allowed him, had he simply gone to a solicitor and made his claim honestly." "But why not simply ask?" Agnes said, bewildered still, despite everything. "Why all this? The key, the letters, breaking in like a common thief. Because, I think, Mrs. Whitfield, he did not entirely trust the law to give him what he believed was rightfully his, having watched his father lose the very same fight once already, 30 years before, against a solicitor's clerk and a brother, both more comfortable and more established than himself. And because, I suspect, once he had begun searching secretly and found nothing on his first attempts, pride and frustration together carried him a good deal further down a dishonest path than he had ever originally intended to walk. It was arranged in the end, with the vicar's quiet cooperation and Constable Palk's rather more nervous one, that a note should be left, quite visibly, upon Rose Cottage's hall table, in Agnes's own hand, mentioning to no one in particular, but easily overheard by anyone watching the house, that Mrs. Whitfield intended to move her late husband's papers to the bank the following morning, as they seemed to be causing so much unwanted trouble. It was, Miss Marple explained privately to the vicar, precisely the sort of bait that a man who had already searched violently and unsuccessfully twice would find impossible to resist, for it suggested, quite falsely, that whatever he sought remained still within the house, and would shortly be placed forever beyond his reach. He came, as Miss Marple had known he would, a little after midnight, forcing the same study window with a jimmy bar and a grim, quiet determination rather different from his earlier, more furtive visits, and found, waiting for him in the darkened room, not an empty house, but Constable Palk, considerably more alert this time, and considerably better supported, standing quietly by the door, with the vicar beside him, and Miss Marple herself seated, with remarkable composure, in Edward Whitfield's own old armchair, by the cold hearth. "Good evening, Mr. Whitfield," she said, as the young man froze, half through the window, torch beams swinging wildly across the room. "Or should I say, Mr. Pembroke? I confess I am not entirely certain which name you would prefer this evening, though I rather think, under the circumstances, it scarcely matters." He might, in that first frozen moment, have run. Was, Agnes said afterward, very clearly weighing the thought. But Constable Palk moved to the window with a speed and firmness that rather belied his earlier mishap with the garden rake, and the moment for flight passed as quickly as it had come. For a long moment, nobody moved. The torchbeam still clutched in his hand threw long, trembling shadows across the disordered study, over the splintered boards and the cold, empty hearth, and Agnes, watching from the doorway with the vicar's steadying hand at her elbow, thought she had never seen a man look quite so young, nor quite so entirely without hope, as Andrew Whitfield did in that moment, framed in the broken window of the house that had once, briefly and long ago, belonged to a family he had never been permitted to call his own. "You've no proof of anything," Andrew Whitfield said at last, his voice low and strained, the pleasant, easy manner of Mr. Pembroke stripped away entirely to reveal something rather more raw and desperate beneath it. "Whatever you think you know, I have your grandfather's own letter in his own hand, stating quite plainly that the land in question was always meant to pass equally to both his sons," said Miss Marple, not unkindly. "I have Mr. Renfrew's written confession of the alteration he made, at your Uncle Edward's request, after your grandfather's death. I have your own boot prints beneath the trellis, and the particular unevenness of your step, which more than one person in this village has now had occasion to notice and remark upon since your unfortunate injury became a matter of some interest. And I have, if I am not very much mistaken, a length of pipe tobacco in your coat pocket at this very moment, of a rather distinctive blend, that Mr. Tompkins the greengrocer's nephew will certainly recognize from your evenings at the Blue Boar." She rose from Edward Whitfield's old chair, small and unhurried, and entirely without malice, and looked at the young man with an expression that held, Agnes thought, watching from the doorway, rather more sorrow than triumph. "You had a just grievance, Mr. Whitfield, and a genuine one. It is a great pity, a very great pity indeed, that you chose to pursue it in a manner that has turned a legitimate claim into something a court of law will be a great deal less sympathetic toward than it might otherwise have been." Chapter 12. The Truth Restored. The matter, in the end, resolved itself rather more gently than the drama of that midnight confrontation might have suggested, for Agnes Whitfield, once the shock and fear of it had faded, proved to have inherited a good deal more of her husband's stubbornness, and a good deal less of his capacity for keeping an old wrong quietly buried than anyone, including Miss Marple, had quite anticipated. "He is family," she said simply, when the vicar gently raised the question of prosecution. "Whatever he has done, and whatever name he has chosen to hide behind. And he had, God forgive Edward for it, every right to be angry. I should like the land divided as his grandfather truly wished, and I should like the breaking and entering forgotten, so far as the law allows it to be, if he will only agree to stop this foolish deception and come to us honestly, as Cecil's son, rather than as a stranger climbing over garden walls in the dark." It was, Miss Marple reflected afterward, precisely the sort of resolution that a court of law would have found a good deal too generous, and that human decency, on the whole, found a good deal more satisfying than any verdict handed down by judge or jury. For Andrew Whitfield, confronted at last with his own dishonesty, and given, unexpectedly, the very inheritance he had schemed so hard and so foolishly to seize, found himself undone rather more completely by his aunt's forgiveness than he had ever been by Constable Palk's belated vigilance. He left St. Mary Mead within the fortnight, his own name restored to him, his grandfather's true wishes finally honoured through the quiet offices of a rather shamefaced Mr. Renfrew, and a small but valuable piece of land at the village's edge, divided, at last and 60 years late, precisely as old Mr. Whitfield had always intended it should be. "I confess," said Agnes, some weeks later, pouring tea for Miss Marple in a sitting-room that had, by slow degrees, begun to feel like her own again, "that I still do not entirely understand how you knew, from the very beginning, that there was anything more to it than an old woman's carelessness with a key." "There is very rarely such a thing as simple carelessness, my dear Mrs. Whitfield, when it comes in threes," said Miss Marple, accepting her cup with the small, contented smile of a woman who took a genuine and uncomplicated pleasure in a well-brewed pot of tea. "A key may be lost, a shepherdess may be dusted round without much thought. But a key and a shepherdess and a bundle of letters retied the wrong way, and the scent of pipe tobacco in a house where no one smokes, that is not carelessness at all, Mrs. Whitfield, but a pattern, and I have found, over a great many years and a great many puzzles, that people are really remarkably similar to plants in a garden, whatever they may believe about their own uniqueness. Left undisturbed, they grow according to their true nature, quite predictably, and it is only when someone has been at them with rather more urgency than usual, pruning here, disturbing there, that one begins to suspect a gardener at work who does not wish to be seen." Agnes laughed, for what felt like the first time in weeks. And Mr. Pembroke's dry slippers? Cecil's angry letters? Mr. Renfrew's guilty conscience? Was all of that simply gardening to you? "Every last piece of it," said Miss Marple comfortably, settling back into her chair with her tea and casting a fond glance toward the window, where the last of the summer light was falling gold across Agnes's own roses and the low stone wall, and the trellis that had been, at Miss Marple's own quiet insistence, very properly mended. "I have lived a great many years in St. Mary Mead, Mrs. Whitfield, and I have found that the human heart, wherever it happens to reside, in a great city or a small village, in a respectable solicitor's clerk, or a bitter young man with a genuine grievance, very rarely surprises me any more in its essential nature, however much it may occasionally succeed in surprising itself. It is, I find, the greatest comfort of my advancing years, and very nearly the greatest pleasure too, though I shall deny most vigorously having said so, should you ever repeat it to Mrs. Hartnell." Mrs. Bantry, calling in a few days later, and hearing the whole story at last from beginning to end, shook her head in the particular fond exasperation of a woman who had watched her friend perform this same quiet magic more times than she could easily count. "I shall never understand, Jane, how you manage to see so very much in so very little. A shepherdess facing the wrong way indeed. I should never have noticed such a thing in 100 years. That, my dear Dolly, is because you are not in the habit of dusting your own mantelpiece, said Miss Marple, with a twinkle that took any sting entirely out of the words. And I have found, over a very long life, that the people who do their own small, ordinary tasks, day after day, are generally the ones best equipped to notice when something in the pattern of them has quietly gone astray. It is not cleverness, Dolly, whatever the village likes to say of me. It is only attention, and a great deal of practice in paying it. And with that, in the golden quiet of a St. Mary Mead evening, with the mystery of Rose Cottage's missing key resolved at last, not with the missing key at all, as it happened, but with a much older key, and a much older truth, both finally restored to the light, Miss Marple finished her tea, admired the roses, and reflected, with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had once again set a small corner of the world back into its proper order, that there were, after all, a great many worse ways to spend one's declining years than in the patient, unhurried business of watching human nature reveal itself, one small inconsistency at a time.